on the show today, Alex King Harris. So Alex is interesting chap. You might say entrepreneur, embodied music producer, background in yoga, a few other interesting bits and bobs. He's how was it that put us in touch originally, Alex? Someone connected.
It was Tad Hargrave.
It was Tad Hargrave, who I just was literally on Mr. Marketing for Hippies. And Tad is a wonderful connector. He's never connected me to someone who wasn't interesting, actually. He's very skillful at that. So I was like, let's get to know this guy. And you've done loads of cool stuff to talk about. So welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Appreciate your time and interest.
And you're in Canada, right?
Yes, West Coast, close to Vancouver on one of the lovely Gulf Islands, Salt Spring Island.
And I know you do a few different things. So when you sort of meet people at parties, people always say that, like, we go to parties. I'm too old to go to parties. When it happens, what do people say? What do you say? They say, what do you do, Alex? And you say,
lately I've gone with music producer. I honestly, the worst is when someone introduces me as a DJ. I just feel like I'm getting sort of stuck in this little label box, but music producer. And then if it goes further from there, I'll say, I run a company and I'm an entrepreneur and do a lot of mentorship work. So it sort of easily parses out into the other things. But I feel like music for me has been the central path that I've been on since I was very young. And it brought me to yoga. It brought me to a lot of the more passionate pursuits that I've had outside of that. So music's still my focus.
If someone said, Mark, why have you got a music producer on the Embodiment podcast?
Yeah.
Now, I know enough about you that it's completely relevant, but how would you make that connection?
Yeah, for sure. So when I was studying jazz in music school in college, I was recovering from a head-on car accident where my intestines had literally exploded on impact. And, the prognosis wasn't great. It was a lot of pharmaceuticals to regulate my digestive system. And I met a guy at music school who was kind of wiser and older, and he turned me on to yoga. And the place where yoga and music collided for me was my own need to just figure out a way to heal myself. And what I noticed pretty quick was that the kind of music that I wanted to make to help me relax and get into my breath more and help my body relax was something that the first few yoga teachers I met were really interested in. And that was sort of mid 90s. So there wasn't a lot of contemporary good yoga music out at the time. Yoga music back then was a bit cheesy.
Okay, we're going to come to yoga music as a thing in a minute, but before we do, music itself we take for granted. Like, it's piped everywhere on the radio and taxi, and you can just put it on your phone. But it's always struck me as a kind of magic. It's a bit weird. Like we take it for granted, but if we step back and go, what is this? There are sounds, and then feelings get created.
Yeah.
Like what is music in that way? I kind of almost want to step back before we go into specifics. I think it's unexamined.
That's great. Yeah, music is a map of frequency, and there are patterns and relationships and ratios in that map that relate to natural structures that remind us of who we are and where we come from. And I think in this disembodied time, to have harmonies and rhythms and sounds that bring us back to sort of our roots, both culturally and genetically, it's a powerful tool to become present again, to our sort of our nature. And one of my first deep studies in this when I got out of music school was taking a yoga teacher training with a teacher who was doing cancer therapy with yoga and music together. And he'd built vibroacoustic furniture. So he had bass wave generators on massage tables, and we would take cancer patients and put them on the table and start kind of producing low bass and then producing higher mid-frequency sounds and high sounds, and just watch what would happen to their breath and to their pace of their whole body language to just start to shift. And that was when I realized what works, what doesn't, what the tools are, why music is the way it is. And it sort of goes beyond stylistic choice and more into just what frequencies do to your body, how they relax you, how they kind of restore you back to homeostasis. And there's a very esoteric study of that you can go very deep into, but yoga has kind of mapped that out in a way.
Right, and it's actually not counterintuitive to most people to think that music can change how you are, because that's why we listen to music. There isn't a practical, inverted commas, reason to do it other than that, right? And people will pay money for music. They'll go quite far for music. They, you know, I remember when I come off a retreat, it's one of the first things I want to listen to some music. You know, and if you haven't listened to music for a while, you're like, this is amazing. This is better than drugs. You know, it's like it does some serious shit. And even like non-hippie people, I think, would admit that. And people love music around the world. Like every culture is part of life and this and that. So it's not really a surprise that it has, you would say, healing qualities or psychoactive qualities, right? Because if it didn't, it wouldn't be music.
Right, sure. Yeah, and it's really easy to sort of get into this prescriptive attitude when you're first embarking on this deeper level of music of like, oh, well, this sound will do this to this, you know, this for sure. But it has a lot of cultural context. Music has the capacity to evoke emotions that we may not be able to get in touch with easily. And that sort of path towards getting back into your body by feeling rage or angst or joy or complex emotional feelings that we have that we may not be in touch with. I think that's part of the beauty of what music can do for us. And we sometimes need to find a culturally important type of music that we really resonate with, that tells us the story of sort of, again, where we come from, who we are, that kind of thing.
As you say, there's big individual differences, cultural differences. You know, someone's in another country, I'm going, how do you listen to this? But you grow up there, love it. And then I remember I was really into heavy metal as a kid, and I remember meeting a lot of like metalheads, and they were like really sweet, nice people.
Yeah, totally.
And I started studying psychology. I was like, oh, they're sort of getting in touch with their rage or their anger. Like, these are the people that need anger. These aren't the angry people.
No,
And I was the sweetest, nicest people you ever meet, like death metalers and stuff, 9 times out of 10, right?
Yeah, because they got the exhaust valve for this cultural angst that is generally poorly dealt with, right? So that's part of the magic, you know.
And then there's the sort of Eastern traditions, right? So, for example, yoga, sound healing, or certain sounds are to do with certain chakras or whatever. It's a kind of quite heavy esoteric study there, right? If you want to go into it.
Yeah, and that helps when you want to have a theoretical background for how to translate contemporary songwriting ideas into sort of some of these ancient maps that are used not in just music, but also in temple architecture, and nature uses them all the time. And you know, visual design, there's a lot of proportions that help you become a better composer that I think can appeal more broadly to a much wider audience, because you're sort of getting into touch with some fundamental truths. But one of the best yoga classes I ever took started with a Rage Against the Machine track. And I was so perfect because I was at a festival where it was too nice.
Right.
And the teacher figured that out, and he just was like, I'm going hard. And the vibe in that moment was so dope, and everybody hit their practice like it was the last thing on earth they were going to do. And it was amazing. You know, it really woke me up to the idea of not getting too, I suppose, too narrow in your focus of what you think embodiment music is, you know, based on sort of
spiritual music is some fucking panpipes or some Asian shit. Anything else, right? Like, you know, spiritual music is sort of reduced to the sort of one food group, one might say. And again, knowing the culture is an important part of that. So, you know, I went to Japan for a while and spent time there. And they have a very different need around music and how it relates to embodiment because of their culture. And one of my favorite stories was a Tibetan monk was taken to some very famous, like the Berlin Philharmonic, and he listened quietly the entire time. And at the end, they were like, "How did you like that?" He was like, "It was terrible." But at the beginning, when they were tuning their instruments, I loved that. That was so cool. You know, really it's sort of this atonal kind of droney. I spoke Tibetan.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned this idea of yoga music. Now, my mum did yoga since the 60s, right? And if I talked to her about yoga music, she'd be quite confused.
Right, sure.
She'd sort of say, well, no, you just do yoga in a silent room. And I remember a traditional yoga teacher friend of mine went for a job interview at a major London yoga studio. And they said, "Oh, what's on your playlist?" And I was like, "I don't have a playlist. I don't own an iPod." So like sort of something has happened in the yoga world from the 60s till now, right?
Yeah, for sure. And in general, because we are so good at commodifying things, yoga has, you know, for certainly deepened in its roots while also being hyper commodified, and music has played a big role in the sort of flashy, you know, hip, trendy side of things that may appeal to some people. But I think yoga music was a term out of lack of a better term, because really embodiment hadn't come to the forefront yet. I would refer, I mean, it's sort of habitual for me to call it yoga music. I would just call it embodiment music that just gets you into your body. And that's sort of the thing.
Music to support coming back to the body, the conscious
Yeah.
experience of the body, as opposed to music that would space out to or something else?
Yeah, like yoga music tends to connote a stylistic genre, whereas embodiment music is really anything that gets you breathing more deeply, feeling your body, wanting to move or relax, depending on what you need. You know, there's some sort of cornerstones that you're looking for when you play to an audience who's wanting an embodiment experience. And a lot of that I learned in yoga classes, but I also learned that at raves on the dance floor playing to, you know, huge crowds of dancers. It's all kind of the same.
So what would be a not embodiment music then? Like, help me make that distinction.
Yeah. So when music becomes commodified and it turns into a pop cultural meme, it's much more about hooking people into a consumeristic relationship with music. And at that point, it's more of a distraction to the breath and, you know, getting into the body. It reinforces negative stereotypes. It creates a consumer model. I used to work doing music videos for big hip hop artists, and I watched how the formula that a lot of pop mainstream hip hop artists were using, that was encouraged by record label executives, was to also sell the cars and the shoes and the clothes and, you know, and have this sort of demeaning attitude towards the feminine. And to me, maybe it's like healthy embodiment versus junk food. You know, it's like you may have a body experience in listening to that. You may feel powerful and strong, but is it really where we want to go as a culture, I guess would be the question.
And you did this Yogitunes. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. That was more out of need. When I say we, I had a couple of co-producers in the early days, Craig Colin, who was part of a project called Shaman's Dream, and Amani Friend, who we started something called Desert Dwellers with. And we did it because we were being asked to write custom music for yoga teachers who needed soundtracks for their instructional videos. And we wrote so much music that we couldn't put it out there fast enough. The record industry back then was kind of like an album release a year was what you got, and anything you had left over, you'd have to wait till the next year. And so we just decided to build an online store to sort of facilitate this growing demand from the yoga teachers for fresh yoga music. And that then made us connect with other artists that were making similar stuff, you know, pairing up with DJs and curators and trying to sort of establish a cultural hub for essentially a shift from the old school artist world of, you know, drugs and touring and a lot of debauchery to something more in line with the yoga lifestyle as sort of a music relationship might go. And now it's much more grown into helping embodiment professionals deal with copyright issues when they put music to their videos online or where they want to teach in a public venue. And our catalog is uniquely cleared for that kind of use. So that tends to be what people use us for, is background embodiment.
Listening to this is for you and also for them listening. Like someone listening to this is like, hey, I do online classes and I want to play some music, but I've got a bit of a problem in the, you know, I can get sued if I play the Black Eyed Peas or whatever, right? I have to be careful what I play.
Yeah, exactly. Now, just to qualify that, we only work with independent artists who own and control all their own rights. So we don't do major label artists like that, although it would be great. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Peas, but we have to kind of sit in the more indie realm. But we have an amazing catalog, 15,000 handpicked songs, give or take. And that's exactly what we are valuable for as teachers, professionals out there who are trying to get their music into their content creation loop. And
for someone like me, who's like embodiment professional, love music, but I'm not like that into it in a way, right? Like it's not like a specialism or real skill. How is it cataloged? Is it like by emotion, or like we have a DJ at a lot of our events, right? Mm-hmm. And what he comes up to me and he says, how do you want them? Mm-hmm. What he means is, what emotion would you like me to encourage and evoke in the break for you to teach afterwards as a bass drum? How do you want them? You know, mm-hmm. and I'll say, well, they seem kind of down. Let's energize people. Let's play some faster music to energize people, because after the break, I want to do something uplifting, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like that's how we do it, one-to-one. How would you do it with a system like this? Yeah, so we mainly start with activities. So you can basically say, I want a 60-minute, you know, gentle flow, and that will give you a bunch of options of DJ curated playlists that are going to take you on a softer arc. You can increase the intensity by choosing a different style. Like if you want, you know, sort of a power type flow, then it's gonna peak pretty high and come down. So our model tends towards the playlist curation, and then it has tags underneath that sort of evoke different moods, if you would.
If you want to build your own, we have a mood section where you could just go in and pick music that's in a certain mood and compile your own playlists. And that kind of combo of pre-curated playlists and a genres and moods section where the words that we use to describe them are more kind of in the context of embodiment rather than like traditional music genres. That works quite well for our audience.
I realized this years ago, like when I go to the gym, for example, I wouldn't really care if it was like Irish fiddle music, punk music, Wagner, as long as it helped me through the gym.
Yeah,
it wasn't really the genre I was looking for. You know, there's some heavy metal, there's some hip hop, there's some you know, there's some classical, a bit less, but you know, there's some stuff in there that just helps me get energized for lifting weights. And like the emotional impact was more important to me than the genre in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our music curators, I would say, specialize in emotional contexts. So that's sort of embedded into the way the content is arranged, especially how we make our playlists. Because, you know, a nice playlist can go through a few different flavors of emotion.
Like
ideally wants to leave you kind of feeling tender and, you know, integrated. But at some point you want the darker angst stuff. And we want to make it so that the DJ part of it is sort of handled and they don't have to do a lot of compiling and selecting. But if they want to go there, they certainly can. You know? I'm
not a fan when I go to a fucking yoga class and they're looking at their iPod the whole time.
Yeah, for sure.
I think your concentration's in the wrong place there, mate. You know, totally. Sort that out beforehand, you know?
Yeah.
There's an art to that, though. Like, I appreciate a great 5 rhythms teacher, for example. You know, I don't do that myself when we have events. I get someone in more skilled in that.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I'm trying to figure you out, Alex, in a way. You've had an interesting life. You did gymnastics, right? Like competitive gymnastics, martial arts. You've been a sort of bit of a rock star yogi at one point, right? You did the whole, what was that like?
It was great. I mean, I think being rising up in that scene, it's different than the mainstream rock star scene because, again, you're dealing with an audience that has some sense of personal empowerment, and that's where they're going. So they're not giving themselves away to worship you, which can be very dangerous. For me, my ego does not need pedestals and projections of like godliness. I just, the acknowledgement and the appreciation fuels the creative process, and that's great. And there's an intimacy when I'm performing to even, you know, some of my bigger classes, I think were 700-800 people at a festival. And I still feel like there was an intimacy and a connection with everybody there and an appreciation for the role that I played in being there of service to their embodiment practice. And so a lot of my fans, I'm still really deeply in touch with. They became really close friends. I very rarely felt that kind of weird, awkward fame thing.
As a yoga rock star.
Yeah, I mean, I pivoted over into playing big clubs for a little while, occasionally. DJ, right? Yeah, DJ. I play like a live DJ set, so I have my electric guitar and I'm singing, and I'll play my own music, and then pivot into DJing, and you know, kind of go the gambit and do something that people haven't seen before. And I think when people are inebriated and drunk and high, they really tend to want to worship you because they want to feel like you seem to feel, you know, and that's just not my jam. That would have been bad for my ego.
Yeah, and you're being modest and Canadian about this shit as well, right? But you've done some stuff like Canadian team, I think, gymnast, right? That's pretty.
Yeah, I competed nationally. I went to like the National Olympics in gymnastics. I won a lot of medals. I was certainly, and it was a really interesting experience actually, because I trained from quite young. I was 7 years old when I started. And I went into competitive gymnastics almost right away, where you're training, you know, 3 times a week, 2-3 hours a day. You've got coaches, you're building a whole repertoire of, you do 6 apparatus, and you're getting a lot of instruction in flexibility, strength building, balance, rotation, gravity. And for years, I didn't think I was that great. And this is sort of like built-in, maybe Canadian modesty, but there was also a lot of bullying in my team. It wasn't very healthy. And one day after a coach really connected with me, he was a guest coach and he was a national certified like Olympic coach. And he came in and he kind of saw me and he was like, "What's wrong with you, dude? Like, why are you holding back?" And, you know, at that point, excuse me one sec. At that point, I made a decision to commit to myself 100% and just sort of ignore all the rest of it. And it was a very unique moment of realizing that I knew myself better than anybody. I knew my body. And as long as I stayed committed to me and forgot about all the social pressures and all this, that I might have a better experience, more fun, more joyful. And in that moment, I became the best gymnast in the club and started winning all the medals. And it was literally one moment to the next. My coach was just like, "What happened to you?" And I was like, "I don't know. I just decided to have fun with it and be myself." You know?
Be yourself is a big move. It's a bigger move than this phrase might suggest in some ways, isn't it?
Absolutely. It was a powerful lesson. You know?
You've also, I'm looking at I've got some notes here you sent me, you've worked with famous Outkast and Sting and music videos for the famous people. You've kind of been a yoga rock star, you've been a successful gymnast. And also, you're doing yoga. I know you're doing original play with Fred Donaldson, who I played with years ago in Poland and absolutely loved it.
You played with Fred?
Yeah, in Poland years ago. And I like his work was a real inspiration for me. Like he's from Aikido background a little bit.
Yeah, so he's full black belt.
From the Aikido world 20 years ago.
Amazing.
So,
he's coming out here this spring, actually. Yeah, I'm going to host him here at my retreat center in the spring. I
remember I read an article in one of Strozzi's books about him playing with wolves. I was like, I have to meet this guy. This is interesting.
Yeah, that's a great story. Oh my goodness. Yeah, the alpha male took his head and pulled it down to the ground to see if he would relax or not. And the moment he just became playful and soft, the wolf let him play with his cubs, and it was like nobody goes in to hang out with these. They were in a recovery center. They'd been trapped. Anyways, it's a wonderful story, and I think to sort of tie it all together. Yeah,
that's what I mean. What's the red thread? That's what I'm trying to get. Entrepreneurship as well. That's not very hippie in some ways,
No. I've been
me, you, and Tad. That's about it. So it's like, what ties it all together? I'm like, who is this guy?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things. Parents who are very supportive, right? I've got open-minded parents who, my mom's an artist and a painter, painter, poet, dancer. They were both educated in Cambridge. My dad's a veterinary surgeon. They have a lot of privilege, but they have a lot of generosity with how they parented me. And the moment I showed interest in something, they were very unpressured about how they helped get me into it and structure it for me, and very considerate of my needs and not overly prescriptive of how they wanted me to be. And so that opened a lot of doors for me, to just try things out and feel free to explore them. And my dad had a great record collection, best music collection you could imagine. So those things kind of mixed together. And I think then I hit the tragedy wall, and it was the physical trauma that came from not only my car accident, but a couple of other doozies in my teenage years and early 20s. One heavy duty close suicide, another really bad love triangle, domestic violence, almost got nearly beaten to death by someone with anger management issues. It just kind of broke me in just the right way to make me really humble, really close to my own death, really aware of the preciousness of what life is. And I had enough tools and resources from my upbringing emotionally to start exploring that unconditionally and not holding back,
It's a sweet spot. You've clearly done a lot of things well and had success in different areas without being too graspy about that from what I hear. Like, there's a sweet spot of I've got enough support, like you mentioned your parents, right? And enough tools, resources, like inner support, we might say as well. And then, there's very people broken in just the right way, or it's like, I see this with people because if they're smashed too hard, they just don't recover.
Right.
Or they've got 20 years of trauma therapy to do before they can be functional, right?
Yeah.
But if they're not smashed at all, you kind of need your head in the wolf's mouth a little bit.
Yeah, you do.
And I feel similarly blessed in that combination of challenge and support. Yeah. There's this very sweet spot, and when people have it through good fortune, grace, whatever, they seem to do a lot of cool shit in the world.
Yeah.
That combination is critical, because if they don't get smashed a bit, they just don't really have the relationship to death and the intensity and the motivation, and it's just a very mundane average life they tend to live. Whereas if people are smashed too hard, they're just recovering.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's not to say that, we don't struggle. I had years of depression and anxiety and no way out kind of feeling, and what am I going to do with myself, and addiction I struggled with for quite some time to cannabis for years, still kind of coming off of that train. But again, that's where I had the support was really there for me when I was sort of down at the bottom and needing to find a way out of a hole. And not everybody has that, so when they do get broken, they don't really know, or they don't have what they need to sort of pick them back up and keep them moving forward. And I think for that, I just keep turning towards gratitude and service. How do I be generous with this gift of breaking in the right way and having the support to truly recover?
something about not getting too attached to an identity as well. Because for example, I know people who are super into the sports identity, and that limits them their whole life, even if they stop doing their sport 20 years ago, or they get into the hippie identity. They're like, right, now I'm a hippie, I'm alternative, I'm a yoga person, whatever it is, and or I'm a musician. That's a real serious identity for some of my musician friends.
Hard one to let go of. Yeah,
they make sure there's always a guitar in the room and it's in shot. So
I'm
just fucking with you now. So that's an identity, right, for some people. And there's nothing wrong with identities. Like, I'm an embodiment trainer, I'm a husband. We have identities, right? I'm a British guy, whatever. But it's the being able to move between them, particularly if I think of, say, entrepreneurship. Tad, I was just literally on the phone, is the guy that introduced us on a Zoom call literally just before we talked. And his whole thing is marketing for hippies, right? Which is, a lot of people go, how do you do that? That's impossible. That's a contradiction, and he's like him, George Cow, and me. That's it. Teaching in the world. It's like maybe Mark Silver, 4 of us in the world. Right. And it's like, there's a lot of hippies who run businesses, but most people aren't able to put those two identities together.
Yeah, a lot of hippies run from marketing for sure.
Yeah. How did you like the business? Like, you say entrepreneur is one of your things, right? One of your main things. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So again, a dad who was a self-made businessman in many ways, even though he wasn't selling that as his identity. He built a very successful veterinary surgeon practice, and my mom supported him in that, and I watched them kind of work as a team. And funnily enough, when he retired, he bought a bead store, like beads and jewelry, kind of a revisit to their Cambridge hippie days, and did really well with that. And so he was actually the first investor for me when I first wrote a very first business plan. And I think his encouragement helped me kind of, again, blossom into that. But I think the identity thing, just to sort of speak to that, is I grew up in Newfoundland, which is a very unique culture. I was born in England, but when I was 6 weeks old, we exited out of the UK and landed in a place where everybody pretty much was from Newfoundland. And literally for hundreds of years, no one really leaves Newfoundland. It's sort of a place that families have been there. There's a few family names that are popular. And I was very much an outsider, and I had to become a lot of different things to survive. I had to be what people needed me to be, because the threat of violence was really real. There was a lot of impoverished people. We were advantaged. We had money and education, and, I was vegetarian. I was left-handed. I was just different enough that,
I also come from a place where being left-handed is enough to make you suspicious.
Oh yeah.
People, that's enough.
Well, they still tied the left hand behind the back in certain schools in Newfoundland when I was a kid to get people to turn to right-handedness, right?
So it's a part of Canada. I'm trying to get my head around it. I don't know it. I know what it is because of Risk, the board game. But
okay.
like Risk teaches you to connect Saskatchewan. I know all the fucking Canadian states, okay? But it's so it's pretty like everyone's cousins kind of thing. People have been there a long time. You come in as an outsider.
Yeah. And it's the furthest eastern province in the country. It's actually a half an hour later than the eastern seaboard. So it's 8 o'clock on the eastern seaboard, 8:30 in Newfoundland is kind of what you'll hear. And it's a very cold and harsh place. And so I think that kind of trained me to be certainly anonymous in my being. And then as I started to get into particularly music and explore fame, I found anonymity was a very comforting idea, that not being the thing that people projected onto was actually a safe way to go. And so I started to sort of dial back my ego to accept some degree of anonymity and smoothness of shifting in and out of this sort of persona of the rock star. And when I moved to LA, I became Rara Avis, which is Latin for rare bird. It was a moniker. I got to be that, and in doing that, I got to go back and forth illegally from the Canada to the States and never get in trouble because my name wasn't on flyers. And again, it was sort of a safety thing for me, not being myself. Now there's an even deeper level of that one of my traumas was as this friend of mine was beating me to death, he was screaming my name at me. And I didn't want to be myself in that moment. So I actually went on a very long journey of kind of abandoning my self-identity constantly to only ultimately come home to who I really am, which is a highly capable, adaptable person that loves life, that doesn't mind being what people need me to be as long as I know who I am. And
that's why I interview a lot of people, right? This is podcast 350 something, right? And I was like, who is this guy? I can't quite. you know, there's something about that kind of stood out, you know, I'm enjoying it, saying cool stuff, like lots of interesting things, but part of me was like, who is he? What's this? All these different roles and different things. And that's really lovely to hear. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think, you know, for me, the training as a musician made me very comfortable as an entrepreneur, especially raising money. I'm essentially performing to investors. I just, you know, I get up there, I know my tune, I've rehearsed it a bunch.
Right,
they want to see something that they identify with and inspires them. You know, I'm riffing out. I'm being a rock star on stage. You know, an easy translation for me.
People don't realize for a lot of investors, it has to make some sort of business sense, but it's often an emotional decision.
Oh yeah, they have to trust you emotionally. Yeah.
Like there's a guy who's just about to lend us 150K and he just likes what we do. And we've talked on the phone a couple of times. He's like, yeah, send me the numbers. But that's not really the main decision. That's just a hygiene factor, right? It's like, they seem to have done some homework. They're not idiots. But like, he just loves what we do and he trusts us. And, you know, there's like, you know, he's not an idiot. We lent him a bit of money, paid that back. So there's a relationship there, but it's surprisingly an inspired decision, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's the best kind of money. Because then there's a human connection that's going to supersede their expectations of you as a business person who can produce all these things that you say you're going to go do with their money, you know.
I won't borrow money off anyone who wants it just for the percentage.
Right. Yeah, that's
because they want a bigger percentage.
Totally.
And B, because it's just the wrong vibe. Do you know what I mean? Like I want people who are like, Mark, I saw your conference, I love it. You know, like this guy said something really fair. It's like, look, I just want to said the percentage back as long as it's fair, as long as I'm not losing money, as long as it's a bit more than I get if I put it in a shitty ISA, you know, like bank account, I'm cool. You know, so you can tell that's not it. And I'm surprised like how many wealthy people, their motivation becomes, I want to use my money in a positive way. It's a surprising number of people.
And I think that trend is growing as people see what money is capable of. It's really, you know, ultimately been one of the biggest reasons why the world is the way it is as far as resource extraction and profit. And there's starting to be some wake up around, if I am wise with my money, it's the best thing I can do for the culture of humanity at this stage of the game.
Big deal, right? It's a big deal.
It's huge.
I've moved kind of categories the last few years, and particularly since the conference a year ago. And a friend of mine sort of trying to move house recently. And he was just a couple of grand short of kind of what he needed to some fees that he wasn't expecting. And I said, he said, he's really stressing about it. And he told me how much money it was. I said, I can lend you that. It's $2,000 because we're in, you know, it's a different category and not in any disrespect to him. It's just the circumstances he's in that were my circumstances 10 years ago. And at the same time, I was borrowing 150 grand off someone else. And it was just it just felt like a nice flow. You know, a bit like, you know, and actually it turned out we needed some web work 2 weeks later, and that's his specialism. So I just given him an advance on a web job that we happened to desperately need 2 weeks later. You know, it was just like we paid him up front for something. So it's just, there can be that nice flow, and no one teaches you that. The normal narrative is get as much money as you can.
Hoard, you know,
make money,
kind of in that
money.
Penny pincher.
The narrative isn't no one taught me how to use money.
Right.
How to use it to help friends, how to use it to start businesses, how to use it, you know, as a boss to be positive with the people that work with me.
Yeah. And I would say if you grow up in an emotionally scarce environment, then your scarcity concept is going to translate to money immediately. And you're going to hoard because your nervous system hasn't been programmed with abundance, you know, basically. And
I would say, I once thought, why are most of my team not entrepreneurs? Because they're as clever as me. They're as creative as me. And half of them maybe a quarter of them could be. A quarter of them just wouldn't want to be. It's not a lifestyle they want. But I reckon about half of them is they haven't sorted that out. So there's too much fear around risk taking. And they go, you know what? I'd rather be paid less and whatever, you know, whatever the thing is. I'm not saying it's an illogical choice. Sometimes I think they made the better choice than me. But I also go, but wouldn't it be nice if they had a choice? Because it often looks to me like they're smart people who haven't quite shifted that piece where they could be. I mean, entrepreneur is just ultimately someone who can self-regulate well enough. Borrow large amounts of money and take risks. That's basically what being entrepreneurial. Like the joke at the conference was, what's Mark's job? Being able to sleep at night. That was always the joke of the conference. You know, and it's like no one else can sleep at night under the same circumstances. So it's that seems like, I don't think people realize as an entrepreneur there's intuition, there's a lot of relationship stuff, as you said, like doing your performance. There's that self-regulation. There's a lot of embodied skills to being an entrepreneur.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you work yourself into the entrepreneurial realms where what you're building is of service to humanity in a good way, then the kind of support you want to attract around you is going to remind you to stay embodied in the whole process. And anytime you're hitting the wall and you go for mentorship, ideally they should be telling you to breathe, step back, stop grinding, go to nature, do the things that help you regulate, because that's going to keep your company surviving, whereas most will fail under the stress when the leaders are freaking out and coping and, you know, doing whatever they do to manage their habits.
Alex, we can't talk about it publicly, but do ask me privately about the secret men's marketing cabal that I'm
okay. Yeah. Okay, great.
I might get a certain handshake and an invite at a certain point.
Yes, so
you might like that one. And let's take it right up to what you've been doing recently. So I got a bunch of stuff from you about what you want to speak about. I was like, cool, it's what I expected. And then you went away on a thing. And then I got a bunch more stuff. So it's obviously something that's excited you, that's made you go like, and you've done some stuff. So I'm imagining you're not easily impressed. This wasn't your first rodeo, right?
Yeah.
So what have you been up to?
Well, it's a culmination of some work that I got involved with when I first started parenting, actually. So, you know, my journey led me to a wonderful marriage that is now transitioned into a beautiful friendship. But I met this young boy at 6 years old whose father was not particularly present, and my parenting skills were ineffective right away. He was so willful in his way of doing things that escalating with him into a power struggle was pretty much pointless. You could, there's no place where he would finally bend and be like, okay, I'm going to do what you need me to do. And I noticed a lot of sort of habitual routines in me that felt aggressive and power hungry. And, you know, when I started looking at it and I related them back to my traumas, and I'm like, okay, I'm a bit of a traumatized parent right now. So how do I get out of that? And thankfully, that led me into sort of traditional men's work in the Mankind Project. And I met Bill Koth. I was living in Ashland, Oregon, where a lot of that started. And there was lots of guys there who'd been through the training and had birthed a unique program for young guys, young boys, and their fathers. And it was a wonderful learning experience of how to stop struggling for power with kids, how to be curious with them. It's called power with versus power over. And you have to do a lot of self-analysis about how you were parented, how you were wired when you were young, how you guided.
It comes out, right? Whatever.
Yeah, you're all over them, right? You're all over them. Yeah. You know, it's basic behavior manipulation. And it took a while to get really honest. It took some older, wiser guys to point out my weak spots, my arrogance, which is how I cope. You know, I'm intellectually strong. I can outword a lot of people, and especially kids. I can talk them into a corner and become very mentally overpowering. And I thought that was me being sort of, you know, peaceful, but I was being very passive aggressive. And so when they sort of fed that back to me and gave me other options of like, look, when you feel that, get curious, try to relax, and just ask the kid, you know, what's going on right now? How would you like this experience to go? What kind of guidelines and boundaries would really help you in what it is that you need? And let's come up with something together that you feel really great about. And then I can support you in that. And that pivot is a massive pivot for parents to make. It's very scary, right? You're losing control of your kid. They're going to grow up into some monster, and you're like, you have no way to contain them. And in that, I found a lot of grief. I found a lot of sadness about the handing down of violence generation to generation, especially for the, you know, there's two different sides of this. There's the masculine oppressive power over handing down, and there's the feminine submissive, you know, kind of quietening down. And whatever you have inside of you is generally flavors of both. There's a lot of violence there. And I think I started to really want to address this sort of cellular memory of cyclical violence in a very real way and not bypass it. And that for me started me on a path of teaching rites of passage, helping particularly fathers and sons dismantle this, you know, some people get defensive when you call it violent, but when you understand where it's come from and where it's going and what it's doing to the family unit, it creates a lot of suffering, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Right. And it's very unvillage minded, right? We just don't have the village mindedness anymore,
Trying to do
because
something fucking insane and impossible, which is live as human animals without villages.
Right. Yeah.
And we're trying to make some modern, my men's marketing group, for example, that's a kind of bit of an online village,
Right. Yeah.
And you're trying to make some substitutes, but it's like, I don't know who my neighbors are.
Yeah.
I don't know that wall. I don't know who's the other side of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
This could be a human being 5 meters away. I have no idea who they are.
Yeah.
I just about know the guy upstairs.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's about it.
Yeah.
And it's like one of my colleagues is a single parent, and I really want her to come to this meeting. And I said, I really need to talk to you. It's really important for the business. I'll fly you in. It's a really nice gig. I'll fly you over. And she's like, I can't do it. It's a school week. And I said, okay, but it's 2 days. Is there not a grandmother? Is there not, and a child's not 2 years old, right? So it's like, is there a grandmother? Is there a sister? Is there a good friend that you can, put your kid with for a couple of days, and he can come if he wants, but no, it's school. He can't. And I suddenly went, oh shit, there's no one. There's no one she can have childcare with. That's so she can't come. And it was like, shit, that just would not have happened in any kind of community. Like if you were in a situation where you're a mother with a single child and no one to help, you were dead.
Yeah, totally.
Right? You were dead. That was it. You and your kid were dead. So it's like, wow, shit. And then the trauma stuff, just really feeling into generations of, my family were indentured peasant farmers in Ireland for hundreds of years. Yeah. Living survival line until World War II, where they were all traumatized. And that was 2 generations ago. Yeah. That's in my bones, man. It's in my bones, all the gender stuff, like a female colleague of mine just yesterday was getting really defensive of me about something. And I went, oh, this isn't about us. Right. This is about what men have been doing to women forever.
Yeah, a long time.
So of course she's getting hyper vigilant about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot in the bones, isn't there? There's a lot there.
Yeah, there is. And it can be overwhelming when you first start to crack it open, right? You don't want to just dive in head on and try and grieve all of that. That would, your nervous system has natural safeguards because you can't tolerate that much grief. So I think the question started to become, okay, so how do you work with this sorrow and sadness? And ultimately, as I started to, particularly coming back to Canada and understanding the plight of the Indigenous people here, with deep respect to the landscape of indigeneity right now and all the trauma that white-bodied people have put on to Indigenous people, the question became, how do I re-indigenize myself? What does that even mean? Am I allowed to do that as a white-bodied person? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And the path is to learn how to grieve well, and to learn how to root into your land and your ancestry and know where you came from, and do some work on all of that.
Just for the record, the Celtic people are the Indigenous people of the British Isles.
There you go.
So I don't like the term white or white-bodied because there's too many groups of people encompassed within that.
Thanks.
A Slav, a Jew, an Irish, and a British person are very different.
Yeah, thanks, man.
In what they're carrying, you know what I mean? So,
thanks. Yeah, and forgive my lack of eloquence around that.
No, but in your Canadian context, it makes sense. There's a clear,
out here, that's sort of the way that it's been referred to. And, so that kind of brought me to find the teachings of Martin Prechtel, who's a Mayan elder who's presided over a Mayan village of 40,000 people in Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. And I came across the work of Stephen Jenkinson, who was the lead social worker at a palliative care center in Canada. He presided over the deaths of thousands of children and counseled families in the process, and discovered how bad we are at dying because of our grief illiteracy. That we wait until the very last minute to learn about this sorrow of loss, and we get crushed by it, and everyone gets paralyzed, and so we cling to life as though that's what we're supposed to do, and it creates a very toxic situation where grief doesn't get to really allow us to move through it into a natural praise of life. And so
let me just pause for a moment. I just want to say those names for listeners. So Martin Prechtel, Prechtel, right?
Martin Prechtel.
Prechtel, excuse my pronunciation. And Stephen Jenkins, so it's Stephen Jenkinson.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. And praise. So there's the grief, and even your statement of sort of grieving well, or dying well. It's not. It's almost a shocking. What do you mean dying well? Dying something to be avoided, surely.
Yeah.
Like that. I can think of sort of samurai. I'm going to write my letter, do my hair, put a bit of rouge on my cheeks, and then go to battle so I die well. But I mean, other than that, like, what does it mean to die well?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what I've learned, understood it to mean is it's not about the act of dying being somehow graceful and painless and well executed. It's about getting in touch with the pain of loss long before you're dying, so that that's not what you're waking up to when you're dying. And that brings us back to the sort of the poverty of our culture has to do with this isolated loss of village. And in that, we haven't learned well to deal with loss, and instead we've been fed convenience and comfort. And our addiction to those things, convenience and comfort, make it very unpalatable to think about pain, right? To even move towards pain consciously as a choice. As it turns out, the pain of loss is a very natural, humanizing thing that once you move through it in a good way, and once you're supported to move through it, you're able to take in the beauty of life. You don't have that kind of numb, flatline response to the gorgeousness of nature and the profoundness of the vessel that we find ourselves in. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I want to underline it in red in a minute. So it's like we're addicted to this kind of comfort and pleasure as a sort of substitute, I think, for meaning, and as a substitute for community and connection. And it's a sort of sweet, tasty substitute, but it's sort of like trying to live on sweets instead of real food, and it's addictive, and it means that we get bad at going towards the necessary pains of grief or conflict in relationship or whatever, ancestral trauma healing or whatever it is, and that actually means we're less happy.
Right.
That this kind of comfort and pleasure is actually a barrier to meaning, to connection, and to happiness. And it's a very, very pale substitute for those things.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, the circuitry of addiction is actually our survival mechanism. And I feel like we're being tested to see, can we grow beyond that limitation of our inherent programming, right? Like, as you probably know, the way addiction works is our basic survival needs, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins are something that can be hacked. And when they get hacked by us or other forces that wanted to exploit those things, it tends to not turn out so well for us, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting one in the modern world, isn't it? I mean, I'm really coming off social media, and I've been a couple of years since I first tried, and now I've had a sort of deep insight of how bad it is for my brain and heart, mind, emotions, and spirituality. And now if I have to download the app to go on there to do a work thing, I'm like, it's like I'm in and I'm out, I'm like, fuck that, and then I delete the app again. It's like 10 minutes out of my day, and I feel like, fucking hell, I'm a priest who just went through a whorehouse. It's sort of like I avoided a problem, I managed it. Like I really have had that, like, I think it's the difference between knowing social media is bad for you or any drug or whatever, and insight into like, I just don't want to fuck myself this way. I care about myself too much.
Yeah.
And then I'm going, God, do I want to keep using it for my business? Do I want to employ Harley to do my social media? And it's like saying, Harley, do you mind drinking this poison for me? Like, is there a better way? Like I'm just picking social media as one of the sort of modern poisons, as it were. It doesn't just have to be chemical ones, right?
Well, I think it's a very unique poison. And in that, because amplified human intelligence, aka AI, is being employed to learn the addiction habits of individuals and turn them on all the time.
It's a super addicted. It's
the craziest crack you could ever imagine, right? It's this evolving crack that learns you in real time and is always paying attention to you. And it can monitor millions of people simultaneously and create highly individualized crack diets that they cannot resist. And there's no regulation for that.
I turned on, it's psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and politically toxic, I think.
Yeah, totally.
I turned on Facebook earlier to prove a point to someone, right? Because I literally just downloaded it for a thing I wanted to poll today, and my person's in America that normally does it. I want immediate answers, so I polled it myself. And I use it, I love it for polling. And I turned it on, and the first thing was like something I really wanted to see, and it was like, it fucking knew. it knew, and I hadn't even I just downloaded the app again. I hadn't used it for weeks. And it was like, it was ready. It was like they're going, okay, not only have I got crack, I've got your favorite crack.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, you know, I've got shit to do today. You know, I'm too busy for this. I want to feel good at the end of the day. Anyway, listen, we're going on a bit of a side around here, Alex. And
no, but I think it's a good way to close here, right? Because we're almost up to time. Is that, you know, essentially because of the rate at which addictive tendencies are scaling due to enhanced elements like AI that are learning our habituation patterns. When I got into, so I gave myself just a few weeks ago sort of this, you know, personal grief ritual, and I went out to nature to be in a conversation with the ocean around my grief and what I was, you know, grieving about. And I'm in this different type of conscious relationship with an entity much vaster than me that can communicate with me in real time and learn my patterns and understand me better than I could ever understand myself. The fundamental place I felt like I got to is, I don't think, like, there's this resiliency that's required in these current times to stay present, but it's not necessarily to solve the problems that we've created in the world. For me, it's about accepting that we've created a dying culture that is profoundly sick and doesn't need fixing or healing, or all we need to do is sort of stay present and release control of what might happen. And you know, in that, I think there's a lot of humanity that we can rediscover. And then I come back from something like that very much willing to give all that I have to help end suffering. And that's my purpose. It just was very simple and very clear. And I'm not trying to, you know, I learned this when I started working with dying people. It's not my job to go in and fix their dying and make them survive something that's unsurvivable. But I can make it a lot more meaningful and a lot more healthy of a scenario by removing all this fear and addiction and habituation and creating a more gracious path to their death, if that's where they are headed. And I think as a culture, that's where we're headed. And we need to sort of learn how to do that with some wisdom and grace and awareness, not without nihilism or apathy or any of the sort of dark, oh my God, like, what are we going to do kind of thing.
Yeah. That's an easy
You really want to look at the signs, like we're in a mass extinction, where our climate is collapsing. You know, there's all these triggers that you're like, yeah, that's pretty fucking serious. Whether we make it out of it is not the question. It's just like, how do we show up in it right now? You know,
movies are getting worse. Music's getting worse. These are the signs. These are the signs.
And some of the signs are children don't want to pay attention to the world that the old people are forgetting. So children can't pay attention anymore because the world that the adults created makes no sense. And the old people are becoming senile faster than ever. They don't want to remember what happened. And those are like sort of markers of a dying culture, if you would.
Wow, there we go. A dying culture. In terms of if people want more uplifting messages, I've actually really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed it. This has been a very rich one. I think I have to listen to it back and digest it.
Me too.
Once I record, I'm like, I'm gonna have to listen to this back a couple of times.
Yeah.
Just to get it all. So awesome. Where do people find you online, Alex? Where's the
thanks. Rara Avis Music, RARAAVIS MUSIC. That's a portal into my music work, my mentorship work, my reprogramming work. It's a portal to Yogitunes. You can talk to me on there. Let's have a chat. I'm happy to connect and go deeper on any of these things. And all love to people out there. And Mark, thanks so much for your time and energy. Really appreciate it.
Oh, real pleasure, son. If people are listening to the podcast, they should check out him on YouTube because Alex has coordinated his jumper, beard, eyes, and the sky above his head. I was trying to figure out what was freaking me out, Alex, and then I realized the exact same blue is a very blue sky behind you. I don't know if you can see self-view.
Yeah, I see
and
that.
Then you've got very blue eyes, and your beard's blue for some reason. I think it's the glow off the screen.
Go figure.
Your jumper's blue. And I just love how you're the bluest person we've ever had on. So if you're missing that, guys, if you're not on the YouTube as well as the podcast. So make sure you check them out there.
I would say I'm ripe with the ocean, the spirit of the ocean. That's what's coming through right now.
Water, blue, deep. It's wonderful. Okay, let's wrap this up. Alex, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Mark. Take care.